stand up and step away from the bag now.
Am I being detained or am I free to go?
You match a robbery suspect. Let me see your ID.
Respectfully, I'm just waiting for the train. What's the legal basis?
The oppressive midnight heat of a Texas July has a way of slowing everything down. It warps the air above the concrete, makes the hum of the fluorescent station lights sound like a heavy electric drone, and drains the patience of anyone forced to stand in it. The commuter rail platform was completely deserted, save for a single man sitting on a concrete bench. He wore faded gray sweatpants, a plain black hoodie zipped halfway against the chill he knew was coming from the air-conditioned train, and a worn canvas duffel bag resting between his sneakers. He looked tired. He looked like any other late-shift worker waiting for the last train out of the city. He didn't look like Marcus Vance, a man with 22 years of law enforcement experience and the newly sworn-in chief of police for a neighboring municipality. 2 blocks away, an entirely different kind of exhaustion was riding in the driver's seat of a black and white cruiser. Officer Paul Miller was 10 hours into a 12-hour shift. He was a veteran of the department carrying 10 years of street experience, but somewhere along the line, that experience had curdled into a rigid set of assumptions. Miller didn't rely on the meticulous legal frameworks he had been taught in the academy anymore. He relied on his gut. He relied on the pattern recognition that told him that decent people weren't hanging around the transit center past midnight. A vague bolo, be on the lookout, had crackled over the radio 20 minutes earlier, an armed robbery at a convenience store a mile away. The suspect description was agonizingly generic: male, dark clothing, carrying a bag, fled on foot. It was the kind of description that could fit 1,000 different people in a 3-mile radius. But to a tired officer looking for a win before the end of his shift, it was a license to hunt. When Miller's cruiser slowly rounded the corner and his headlights swept across the desolate transit platform, the beams caught the solitary figure of Marcus Vance. Miller's foot hovered over the brake. He saw a man. He saw a dark hoodie. He saw a bag. In Miller's mind, the puzzle pieces snapped together with a dangerous, premature certainty. He didn't see a citizen waiting for a train. He saw a suspect. This is the precise moment where modern policing often fractures. It is the moment where implicit bias and the illusion of intuition override the strict, unyielding boundaries of the United States Constitution. Miller cut the wheel, bumping the cruiser's heavy tires up onto the pedestrian curb and threw the vehicle into park. He didn't turn on his overhead lights, a conscious choice. Overhead lights triggered dash cams in many departments, and Miller was just doing a knock and talk, a consensual encounter, or so he told himself. But the moment he stepped out of the vehicle, unclipped the retention strap on his holster, and aimed the blinding beam of his heavy tactical flashlight directly into Vance's eyes, the encounter ceased to be consensual. "Hey you, stand up," Miller's voice echoed sharply across the empty platform. It wasn't a request. It was a command given under the color of law. Marcus Vance squinted through the blinding glare. He didn't make any sudden movements. His hands remained resting loosely on his knees. As a veteran cop, Vance immediately recognized the posture, the tone, and the tactical positioning of the officer standing 15 feet away. He also recognized the immediate, glaring procedural errors unfolding in real time. "Can I help you, officer?" Vance asked, his voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of the panic Miller expected. "I said stand up and step away from the bag," Miller barked, closing the distance by a few paces. Vance slowly got to his feet, leaving the bag on the bench. He kept his hands entirely visible, out in the open, waist high. "All right, I'm standing. What seems to be the problem?" "We got a robbery in the area. You match the description," Miller stated, his flashlight beam never wavering from Vance's face. "Let me see your ID." This is where the invisible lines of the Fourth Amendment are drawn. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. For an officer to legally detain someone, to freeze their movement and compel their obedience, they must possess reasonable, articulable suspicion that the specific person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. This standard, established in the landmark Supreme Court case Terry v. Ohio, requires more than an unparticularized suspicion or a mere hunch. A generic description of a male in dark clothing in a sprawling urban area does not legally constitute reasonable suspicion to detain an individual who is simply waiting at a public transit station. Furthermore, under Texas law, a person is not legally obligated to provide a physical identification card unless they are lawfully arrested or if they are driving a vehicle. Providing a false name is a crime, but remaining silent or refusing to hand over a wallet during a mere investigative detention is a right. Vance knew this. He had taught this exact constitutional threshold at the police academy. "Officer, with respect, dark clothing isn't a description," Vance replied, his tone remaining conversational, deliberately avoiding any escalation. "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" The question hit Officer Miller like a physical blow. In Miller's worldview, citizens did not dictate the terms of an engagement. The assertion of constitutional rights, a bedrock of the American legal system, is too often misinterpreted by poorly trained or ego-driven officers as a form of verbal resistance. Miller didn't hear a citizen calmly exercising his rights. He heard contempt. He felt his authority being challenged by a man he had already internally convicted of being a street-level criminal. "You're detained," Miller snapped, his temper flaring. "Now give me your ID or I'm going to put you in handcuffs for failure to identify." "You and I both know Texas Penal Code Section 38.02, Vance countered, his voice dropping slightly in pitch, taking on the authoritative cadence of the commander he was. "Failure to ID only applies if I am lawfully arrested, and you haven't established probable cause for an arrest. You haven't even established reasonable suspicion for a Terry stop. I am just waiting for the northbound train." The use of legal terminology shattered Miller's script. Instead of pausing to reassess the situation, instead of asking himself why a supposed armed robber was calmly reciting the state penal code with absolute precision, Miller's cognitive dissonance triggered a physical escalation. When an officer's authority is questioned and they lack the intellectual or procedural tools to justify their actions, they often resort to the one tool they have absolute faith in: force. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller ordered, his voice echoing loudly. He stepped forward, reaching out to physically grab Vance's arm. "Do not touch me," Vance said, his voice ringing out clearly. He did not step back, but he squared his shoulders. "You do not have probable cause. You do not have reasonable suspicion. You have no legal basis to put your hands on me." Miller didn't care about the legal basis anymore. His internal narrative had completely overridden reality. He lunged forward, grabbing Vance's left wrist and violently twisting it behind the older man's back. The struggle that followed was not a drawn-out Hollywood brawl. It was a fast, brutal, and entirely one-sided application of unnecessary force. Vance, despite his training, made the conscious, split-second decision not to actively fight back. He knew that striking a uniformed officer, even an unlawful one, was a surefire way to get shot in the dark. Instead, he stiffened his body, trying to maintain his balance as Miller wildly attempted an unbalanced leg sweep. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Miller yelled into his radio mic, broadcasting a chaotic narrative back to dispatch. With a hard shove, Miller forced Vance face first into the concrete wall of the transit shelter. The impact split the skin above Vance's left eyebrow, sending a warm trickle of blood down his face. Miller kicked Vance's legs apart, forcing him down to his knees, and then drove his knee roughly into the center of Vance's back, pinning him to the filthy concrete. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Vance's wrists, biting into the skin. "You're making a massive mistake, son," Vance grunted, his face pressed against the ground. "Shut up," Miller breathed heavily, adrenaline flooding his system. He began to aggressively pat down Vance's pockets, searching for the weapon he was so certain was there. There was no gun. There was no wad of stolen cash. He reached into Vance's back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. The distant wail of sirens began to cut through the heavy night air. Backup was arriving, summoned by Miller's panicked radio calls. 2 more cruisers screeched to a halt at the curb, their red and blue lights throwing chaotic, strobing shadows across the station. 4 officers, including a shift sergeant named Davis, sprinted onto the platform, hands on their weapons, expecting a shootout. What they found was Miller kneeling on the back of a middle-aged man who was bleeding from the forehead and completely subdued. "What do we got, Paul?" Sergeant Davis asked, slowing his pace as he saw the scene was secure. "Robbery suspect. Refused to ID. Resisted arrest," Miller rattled off, the lie forming so naturally it was almost reflexive. He opened the wallet he had just pulled from the suspect's pocket, intent on finding a name to run through the system. He flipped the leather flap open. The air on the platform seemed to instantly evaporate. Miller didn't find a standard Texas driver's license. The first thing that caught the flashing police lights was a heavy, gleaming gold shield. Pinned right next to it was a laminated identification card. It bore the seal of the neighboring city's police department. Above the suspect's stern photograph were 2 words printed in bold black letters: Chief of Police. Miller's hands began to tremble. He stared at the badge, then down at the man bleeding on the concrete beneath his knee, and then back at the badge. The adrenaline that had fueled his aggression instantly turned to ice water in his veins. Sergeant Davis, noticing Miller's sudden paralysis, stepped closer and shined his own flashlight on the open wallet. Davis inhaled sharply. "Get off him!" Davis ordered, his voice low, urgent, and laced with absolute dread. "Miller, get off him right now!" Miller stumbled backward, releasing his weight. Sergeant Davis knelt down, carefully gripping the chain of the handcuffs. "Chief Vance?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Take these off me, Sergeant," Vance said coldly, turning his head to look up at the ring of officers. There was no dramatic confrontation in that moment. There was no shouting. The silence that fell over the platform was heavier than the Texas heat. It was the suffocating silence of an institution realizing a catastrophic failure. The handcuffs clicked open. Vance pushed himself up off the ground slowly, wiping the blood from his eye with the back of his hand. He dusted off his sweatpants, picked up his duffel bag, and turned to look at Officer Miller. Miller looked physically sick. He was pale, his eyes darting around, desperate for a way to rewind the last 5 minutes. He expected the chief to start screaming, to demand his badge on the spot, to threaten him with immediate termination. But Vance didn't yell. His voice was devastatingly calm. The voice of a man who had spent 2 decades taking apart criminal enterprises and knew exactly how to dismantle a bad cop. "You didn't ask for my name," Vance said, staring directly into Miller's eyes. "You didn't ask where I was coming from. You didn't establish a timeline. You saw a shadow, you made an assumption, and you let your ego write a check your training couldn't cash. You violated my Fourth Amendment rights because you felt disrespected." "Chief, the radio call, it said dark clothing," Miller stammered, attempting to cling to the fragile thread of his initial justification. "Save it for internal affairs, officer," Vance interrupted, walking past him. He looked at the sergeant. "I want a supervisor to document my injuries. I want a photographer out here, and I want the footage from that camera." Vance pointed to a black dome secured to the ceiling of the transit shelter. "Preserved immediately. If that footage goes missing, Sergeant, I will personally see to it that the FBI opens a civil rights investigation into this entire precinct." The aftermath of police misconduct is rarely as swift or satisfying as a movie. There is no instant justice. Justice is a bureaucratic crawl, buried in paperwork, union reps, and administrative leave. By the next morning, Officer Miller was suspended with pay. The police union immediately released a carefully worded statement emphasizing the danger of the job, the late hour, and the split-second decisions officers must make in the field. They tried to spin a narrative that the chief had been uncooperative, that he had reached for his waistband, that he had taken a bladed, aggressive stance. But the security camera did not have an ego, it did not have a union, and it did not have an instinct for self-preservation. 3 days later, the chief of Miller's department, the mayor, and an independent investigator sat in a sterile conference room and watched the silent, high-definition footage from the transit station. The video was damning. It systematically dismantled every single line of Miller's official report. The report stated that the suspect was pacing erratically. The video showed Vance sitting perfectly still on a bench. The report stated that the suspect refused lawful commands and acted aggressively. The video showed Vance standing calmly, his hands fully visible at all times, making no sudden movements. The report stated that the suspect violently resisted a lawful pat-down. The video showed Miller launching an unprovoked physical assault on a man who was simply stating his constitutional rights. The video laid bare the fundamental flaw in Miller's policing. He had manufactured a crime to fit his bias. He had mistaken a person's lawful refusal to submit to an unlawful demand as evidence of guilt. He had used the color of law not to protect the public, but to punish a man for failing to show blind deference. The procedural errors were so egregious, so clearly documented, that the protective walls of the department crumbled. You can often defend a mistake made in the heat of a genuine struggle, but you cannot defend a constitutional violation caught in high definition. You cannot defend the violation of the Fourth Amendment when the victim is a man who enforces it for a living. Officer Paul Miller was stripped of his badge, terminated from the department, and eventually faced state charges for official oppression and assault under color of authority. The system, prodded by the undeniable truth of a silent camera and the unimpeachable credibility of the victim, finally corrected itself. But as Marcus Vance sat in his own office weeks later, the bruise above his eye faded to a dull yellow. He didn't feel a sense of victory. He looked out his window at his own patrol cars rolling out for the evening shift. He knew that the only reason he received justice was because of the gold shield hidden in his back pocket. If he had just been a tired warehouse worker, a night shift janitor, or a college student trying to get home, the outcome would have been drastically different. The false report would have become the official truth. The unlawful arrest would have become a permanent record. The excessive force would have been rubber-stamped as standard operating procedure. It leaves us with a chilling realization about the fragile nature of our rights when the sun goes down and the streets empty out. If the Constitution only protects you when you have the power to enforce it, is it truly a right or merely a privilege? And when the cameras aren't watching, who protects the innocent from the people sworn to protect them?